3. Right after I do chapters 1 and 2. I can't multitask. I was closing the door at the same time. Well, we may actually get to chapter 3, actually, believe it or not. In my somewhat survey approach to the book of Micah, Micah's challenging a little bit because he's going to use a lot of names of what appears to be places, but then you look on a map and you're like, well, where is that? And so he's using names sometimes by their definition. It reminds me a little bit, and maybe I'm a little bit ahead of myself, but if I'm allowed to say this, but I'm going to. If I told you folks from here in Payton City, if I said you were down in Dogtown, right? You'd remember maybe the old, or if I said you lived down Hoopie, right? And so you don't. That's not a place on the map, right? You're not going to be able to look on a map and see that, but you know where it is, right? Or you know the area that's referencing, or why. Unfortunately, maybe why they're calling that, but you may. And my point is simply this: I believe that's what Micah's doing. He's referencing places by their definitions at times. He's referencing places maybe that they would know, that maybe aren't necessarily like Jerusalem, where you can point on a map and say, there it is, or Bethlehem and point at a map and say, there it is. Sometimes he'll combine names that can make it more challenging to kind of figure out exactly, is he referencing a point on a map? Is he referencing something that maybe happened there? Or is he referencing someplace by what it's known for as it relates to the prophecy that he brings? So Micah, he presents some challenges to us, especially in the early part of the book. To me, one of the great narratives within the book of Micah is going to come in chapter 6, when God puts him on trial. And he calls the mountains to be witness, and he basically is the prosecutor of the case. And so it's an interesting read when you get to that point. We won't fast forward quite to there yet, but there are things to be learned, but it can be challenging, and so just be aware of that as we move through this narrative. And we're not, again, necessarily going to be able to pull up a map and say, well, he's talking about here, he's talking about there, he's talking about here and there. It's just not going to work exactly in that same fashion. Now, we introduced this book on Sunday. For those who weren't with us, we pointed you to 2 Chronicles chapter 28 and suggested, if you weren't in that class, to go ahead and read that, because it lets us know about who? Ahaz, right? We're dealing with the time period, the word of the Lord that comes to Micah the Morashite in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. You can understand the narrative a lot better when you especially go back and look at what kind of man Ahaz was, right? And the condition and the sinful condition of the people under his leadership, and the things that were happening to their own children that they were doing in that time period. And when you read that, you can get clarity as to exactly why God would bring this judgment. It doesn't take you long to read through that narrative and begin to draw a picture of what kind of people they had become. And it's no wonder that God sends Micah the prophet and says, judgment's coming to Judah. Even though of those three, you have at least one what? One good king, right? Which one is it? Hezekiah, right? He comes, though, at the latter end of Micah's prophecies. He comes on the scene later. And we've talked already in our study about the fact that Hezekiah is is a king that allows for the people to have a reprieve. They last a little longer because of men like him. But the judgments and the consequences of their prior behaviors, like under the leadership of Ahaz, is ultimately going to come to fruition. Even though they might buy themselves, in a sense, a little more time because of good kings like Hezekiah, who does a better job. So, hear all ye people, hearken, O earth, in verse 2, and all that therein is, and let the Lord God be witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine a more solid witness than the testimony that Jehovah God could bring. When the prophet comes to them and says, listen, God Himself is going to testify in this case against you. Again, I pointed to you to the fact that when you get to about chapter 6, there's going to be kind of a courtroom scene, if you will, and you're going to see God put them on trial there in chapter 6. But in the early part of the chapter here, we get kind of a sense of what's going to happen within the prophecy. Let the Lord of God be witness against you. It's coming. The Lord from His holy temple. What kind of altars and temples and places, high places, had they designed? Idolatrous, right? Not ones governed by Jehovah. Not places where they would go and worship God as they should. They had allowed, even in the four corners of Jerusalem. You remember, Ahaz locks up the temple. Says, temple's closed for business. You want to worship something, go worship these idols that I've set up in the corners of Jerusalem. And you remember, he takes the pieces and the utensils and the vessels out of the temple that were intended for the worship of God, cuts them in pieces and sends them out to these other places of idolatrous worship. And so that's the imagery. And God's coming. He's sitting on His holy temple. He's going to bring testimony and witness against them. And He's seen a lot. He's seen a lot of behavior that's challenging. For behold, the Lord cometh forth out of His place and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth. Are we always in the presence of God? That sounds like a silly question. We're always in the presence of God. Is it possible for men to feel like they're not in the presence of God? Or to convince themselves? Yeah, okay. So men have done that on many occasions where they convince themselves that they're hidden from God. God doesn't really see it. He's not really aware of what's happening within us. And so the imagery that the prophet brings is, you can't hide because God's doing what? He's coming to you. Right? He's been witnessing these things and seeing these things from His holy temple. But He's seen enough, and He's coming down to bring this judgment. The visual picture of that is powerful. That your judgment that's coming is going to be delivered in a very personalized kind of way. As God figuratively here comes forth, and in many senses literally comes forth out of His place to tread upon the high places of the earth. God's tolerance for their idolatrous worship, His tolerance for them elevating these high places of worship rather than where? At the temple in Jerusalem where they should have been worshiping. The tolerance level of that is going away quickly. And so He's bringing this judgment against them. The mountains shall be molten under Him. Valleys shall be cleft, a wax before the fire, as the waters that are poured down a steep place. For the transgression of Jacob is all this, and for the sins of the house of Israel. What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? Samaria had become the center point, right, of worship rather than there in Jerusalem. If you recall, when Jesus encounters the woman at the well, He has a conversation with her. What is it, John 4, I believe? My brain's thinking here for a minute. Let's think that's right. And He encounters her and has that discussion. And she said, our fathers have done what? Worshipped where? We've worshipped right here in these mountains of Samaria for a long time. You Jews, you guys think you've got to go down to Jerusalem. And then that's when Jesus teaches that message about the time's coming when you're not in Jerusalem or on this mountain, but all men will worship God in spirit and in truth. But it was still happening. Here you are, the sins of Samaria, the challenges they had brought to themselves because of the idolatry that was rampant in that region is starting to come and have an effect on the people. And even in the days of Jesus, several hundred years later, that feeling is still there as it relates to that. The challenges is Samaria. What are the high places of Judah? Judah, are they not Jerusalem? Here was the place that was supposed to be holy. God had been sitting on His holy temple. He should have been witnessing holy divine worship within His temple in Jerusalem. But that's not what He was seeing. What He was seeing was Jerusalem had been turned into a place of idolatry just like everywhere else had been. And you might think in one sense it's one thing that if Samaria kind of gets overrun with idolatry, but it's a whole other issue when you think of the one place that should have been sacred before Jehovah, the one place that should have been the last refuge, if you will, of people coming and worshiping God in the right way. If any place was going to have it, Jerusalem would have it. And they don't. And they don't. And so God says that you want to know why this judgment's coming? Just look through what's going on in Samaria. You want to know why I'm coming down among you? I'm going to tread down those high places? Look what you've done to Jerusalem. It's not the place that was supposed to be. It's not a place where I'm honored any longer. And so therefore I will make Samaria as a heap of the field and as plantings of a vineyard. I will pour down the stones thereof into the valley, and I will discover the foundations thereof. Think about that. The destruction will be so severe that He knocks it clear down to the what? Clear down to the foundation. I mean, that's the magnitude. The graven images thereof shall be beaten to pieces, and all the hirers thereof shall be burned with fire, and all the idols thereof will I lay desolate. And she gathered it of the hire of an harlot, and they shall return to the hire of an harlot. And therefore I will wail and howl. I will go stripped and naked. I will make a wailing like the dragons, and mourning as the owls. It's it's interesting. Were any of you, what was that, 2011? That I'll never say it right, whatever they called that, derecho, or whatever they called that storm that came through. Were any of you happen to be outside when that first started to come through? I was Deborah hollered, and she knew there was a storm coming, and so I was down in the basement with the boys, and you could, I don't know what all you could do, but you don't know anything. I can't tell you how many times storms have come and gone. I didn't even know it rained if I'm clear down at the bottom of the basement. So she hollers down. She says, "Storm's coming. You may want." We had a little volleyball badminton net setting out. She said, "You may want to go take that down and set it down." I don't want got that, and you could hear just that sound of that roaring wind. I run in the house, and Deborah can remember. I said, "I got no idea what's coming at us, but we're going to the basement because this, whatever it is not good. I've never heard anything like this roar." When God brings this judgment, the wailing and the howl, the power of God. I will go stripped and naked. That's not, our imagery's hard there because when we think of those terms. But one who would take their outer garment off would be considered naked in that day. And so you would do that to do what? To do work, right? If you were going to exert yourself in some fashion, you might take that outer garment off in order to accomplish that. And so when I come, I'm taking the outer garment off. I'm coming with force and power, with wailing and howling, the noise of a what? Like the dragons. It's amazing. The fierceness as God describes this judgment that is coming. And can you imagine? I mean, I think about how scared I was in that moment just hearing that storm coming towards us. Can you imagine the sound of the judgment of God pouring down out of His holy temple, coming down among men and bringing His justice to His own people? It's a pretty fierce and vivid description when you think about how He describes the judgment when it will arrive. And that's happening because her wound is incurable. For it has come unto Judah, He has come unto the gate of my people, even to Jerusalem. Just like you would have thought that there would be one last refuge of places where you could go and still people would worship and honor God in the right ways. But in the same token, that location in the minds of the people, they believed that irregardless of their behaviors and choices and decisions, that it wouldn't matter what they did, God would always protect Jerusalem. He won't let anything happen to Jerusalem. Yeah, He might let a judgment happen over here or over there in this location or that location, but not not where the holy temple is. And he says, that's exactly where I'm coming. Even the places where you feel like I would never come and bring judgment. Even the places that you feel like are secure and outside of the bounds of the judgment of God, I'm coming, even to Jerusalem. Don't bother declaring it to Gath. Weep ye not at all in the house of Ephraim. Roll thyself, or in the house of Ephraim, roll thyself in the dust. By the way, I think Ephraim means dust. Roll yourself in the dust of the town of dust is the imagery there. And Gath was a stronghold of the Philistines, I believe, if you go back in your history a little bit. But the imagery here is just, don't cry. None of that's going to help. None of that's going to change anything. Pass ye away, thou inhabitant of Zephyr, having the shame naked. The inhabitant of Zanah came not forth in the morning of Bethesel. He shall receive of you his standing. For the inhabitant of Maroth waited carefully for good, but evil came down from the Lord unto the gate of Jerusalem. You running in. Don't go cry and weep and howl in front of others, hoping that it won't change what I'm doing. I'm coming, even to the gate of Jerusalem. I'm coming. Thou inhabitant of Lachish, bind the chariot to the swift beast. She is the beginning of the sin to the daughter of Zion, for the transgressions of Israel were found in thee. And therefore shalt thou give presents to that big long name in the houses of Achzib, and shall be a lie to the kings of Israel. Yet will I bring an heir unto thee, O inhabitant of Mareshah. He shall come unto Adullam, the glory of Israel. And so, in the midst of Maroth, or bitterness is the definition there. In the midst of Achzib, which is, I believe, defined as deceitful and lies. In the midst of all that, difficulty and challenge is on the horizon. He does seem to send some glimpses. We'll see it more in chapter 2, I think, in relationship to the hope that can be found in Jesus eventually. But at this point, it's pretty sad description. Make thee bald, and poll thee for thy delicate children. Enlarge thy baldness as the eagle, for they are gone into captivity from thee. There were certain restrictions, by the way, what they could do and what they could not do with their hair, and what portions and manner they weren't allowed to cut it in the fashion that some of the worshipers of false gods were, with certain rounded edges. And they, if you've seen any of the traditional Orthodox Jews, and you see that the hair that comes down from the temple, because they're not supposed to cut that portion. And so I remember when I shouldn't tell you the story, but I'm going. When the band went to New York City, when the very first year we moved here, and Sam was in 8th grade, and they took the band to New York City, we pulled into the hotel, and all the kids said, "Look, what are all these Amish folks doing here at the hotel?" And we had to educate them that these were Orthodox Jews they were looking like. They'd never been out of, they're hillbillies out of West Virginia. They've never been anywhere. But they're still, to this day, my point is this, to this day, there are still Orthodox Jews who won't cut that hair that's coming down from the temple side. But he says, shave it off. That's what God says to him. Make thee bald. Poll thee for thy delicate children. Enlarge thy baldness as the eagle, for they are going into captivity from thee. Several imageries that you might think of there, but to me, what he seems to be saying is your customs and the traditions and even the laws, that your honoring of that's not going to help you. You're trying to go. You might as well just shave your head, because it's not going to change the judgment. It's not going to make anything any better if you honor some ceremonial kind of things. God's coming to the gate of Jerusalem, and it won't matter whether you're trying to honor a handful of the restrictions or laws or not. Now, there were some exceptions to that, by the way, and some various laws that governed that. If you recall, the Nazarites had certain restrictions and as it related to their hair and what they were allowed to do and not allowed to do. at times. Thoughts or questions up to that point through chapter 1? The chapters are small. I told you we might move somewhat quickly through them just as we get this picture. Go ahead, Zane. I'm sorry. I didn't see you. Yep, let me go back. No, I didn't, but I'll take a quick look. By definition of the Hebrew word, according to Strong's, they're calling that a female jackal, and so that might help us actually in some ways understand the noise of that when it comes and brings judgment. Thank you for pointing that out to me because I had not done any looking at whether there were other translations of that original Hebrew word. But yes, female jackal is a definition of that same Hebrew word. Any other questions? All right, jump over to chapter 2. So now a pronouncement. Woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. When the morning is light, they practice it because it is in the power of their hand. There are some senses that sin is sin is sin, right? In some senses, all sin bringeth forth death. All sin has consequence. All sin brings the wages of death. So there's the very general sense that irregardless of how you would qualify or view certain types of sinful behaviors, that they all ultimately end in the same kind of consequence or challenge. But there does seem to be a greater sense of condemnation that comes within Scripture when men are willfully choosing to devise and create the measures by which they're sinning through. It doesn't mean that if you unwittingly commit sin that you're somehow excused. That's not the point I'm making. But there's definitely within Scripture on various occasions where the Bible seems to be very clear that there's this sense of greater condemnation when God looks down at people who should have known better, people that should have understood His will and purpose, should have understood the morality that He desired for them, and they chose to devise iniquity and sin and lawlessness anyway. Oh, they're literally working at finding ways to sin. They're creating ways to sin. In the New Testament times, Paul wrote and said, "Make no provision for the flesh." In other words, don't do things that will promote or lead you towards sinful choices. Make no provision towards sin. Don't do the things that are going to lead you to or set you up to behave in sinful ways. Same kind of thought here. Woe to you, because you're devising iniquity. You're creating ways to sin and be lawless. You're evil ways. And you do it in the middle of the day, in the morning light. You practice it. It's almost the idea here that you've devised it, you're practicing or you're preparing yourself and engaging in these things, and it's in your power of choice. Power's in your hands. They covet fields, they take them by violence, and houses, and take them away. So they oppress a man in his house, even a man, and his heritage. It's pretty sad. They without conscience would covet another man's field and with violence go and take that. But that shouldn't be all that odd, right? Because what leader did that? Ahab, right? That's the mindset of Ahab. He coveted whose? Naboth's. And because it was nigh unto his palace. And so he goes and wants him to make a trade. And he said, "That's my what? What did he say? That's my heritage. I can't just make a trade for you. This has been part of the heritage." And going to be with me, and then it's going to get passed down, and it's part. And who steps in? Jezebel steps in and creates all those difficulties and problems. And they've been taking the vineyard because he goes and Ahab goes and pouts over. And so we've witnessed even among their leaders at times, various kings in both kingdoms that lead people to behave this way. You want a field? Just take it with violence. You want that guy's house? Just use violence to take it. Find a man who's weak and vulnerable? They use oppression towards him. Even a man's heritage. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, behold, against this family do I devise an evil. You've been devising evil and iniquity and sins and lawlessness. You've been devising because of your covetousness over a man's vineyard or his house or his family. You've been devising all kinds of ways to go and take what doesn't belong to you. Well, guess what? I can devise some things too, God says. And therefore, thus saith the Lord, behold, against the family do I devise an evil, from which ye shall not remove your necks, neither shall you go haughtily, for this time is evil. If you don't go haughtily, what's that mean? You go, what's the opposite? Humbly, right? In shame. So you'll not even, I'll put a yoke around your necks, captivity that's coming. And you'll not go with pride and exaltation. You'll go with humility. You'll be humbled by this experience, for this time is evil. And that day shall one take up a parable against you. You know, we have an obligation as a congregation, as a collective body of believers, to do the best we can to present to the community and to those around about us who God is and what He's about and what He desires. And they deserve to have the right kind of image of God. Some people won't see God other than what they see in us. We sing a song. I don't know whether it's in this song book or not, but we sing that song, We Are the World's Bible. God has no hands but our hands. That imagery is true. The people round about us ought to be able to see God in us. They had become so evil that the people round about them were making jokes about them, writing parables, little stories about God's people. Rather than elevating God's people because of the God they serve, they're writing these little stories about them and little parables against them. Lament with a doleful lamentation and say, we be utterly spoiled. He hath changed the portion of my people. How hath He removed it from me? Turning away, He hath divided our fields. How could this happen? That's what they're saying. That's what you're going to end up. You'll be utterly spoiled. What had been the portion that God had been delivering to you regularly, giving you everything that you needed and blessing you, it goes away and removed it from you. And you're going to see the dividing of your fields. You're going to be taken off into captivity, and as you're leaving, you're going to look back and see somebody else be handed your land and your heritage. And you're going to wonder in your mind, well, how could this be? How could any of this happen? Therefore thou shalt have none that shall cast a cord by lot in the congregation of the Lord. You measure things up as much as you want. And none left. It will become the portion of another because of the way you treated the heritage of another man, because of the way you coveted another man's house and vineyard and property, the way you used violence or whatever source or whatever means by which you had at your disposal to go and to take that from him. There'll not be anything left for you to even measure. Well, he's talking about everybody. I think he's talking about, but obviously the more you had, the more you'd lose. And so there's some relevance there. But this is what's going to happen to the nation as God comes and brings this judgment. Prophesy ye not, Say they to them that prophesy, they shall not prophesy to them. They shall not take shame. That's what they're going to try to say. Quit telling us this destruction. We don't want to hear, we don't want to hear anything that's contrary to what we're doing. We don't want to hear anything that challenges us. They won't listen to the prophets. Thou that art named the house of Jacob, is the Spirit of the Lord straitened? Are these His doings? Do not my words do good to him that walketh uprightly? You keep rejecting everyone who comes and prophesies and tries to encourage you to see the right way, who tries to help you understand what God is instructing you in, gives you guidance to what God desires. You reject all of them and say, we don't want to hear that. We're not interested in any truth. We're not interested in any challenges. We're not interested in the behaviors that we need to change. But He said, if you would just do my words, would I not honor the ones that walk uprightly? Would He not continue to bless? The blessings are cut off and you lose your land and your property and your heritage because you won't listen to the instructions that are coming. And because you won't listen, you won't walk uprightly. And even of late my people is risen up as an enemy. You pull off the robe with the garment from them that pass by securely, as men averse from war. Think about that phrase. My people is risen up as an enemy of God. That's how rebellious they had become. They're in absolute and utter rebellion against all that is right and good. They've been devising evil for so long, they refuse to even consider what God's teaching them is right. They refuse to even consider anything that would bring benefit to them. Completely disconnected from Jehovah. Even the women of my people have you cast out from their pleasant houses. From their children have you taken away my glory forever. I believe the imagery, by the way, there's probably more like a widow than just generic woman. The idea is you'd even to go in. This is how evil you become. You'll go in and you'll take from even a widow and what little bit of heritage of children she has left, and you'll even take. That's how evil you've become. That you'll even take advantage of the most vulnerable among you and take away what little benefit they had. New Testament times, things haven't changed a lot. Jesus comes on the scene. He finds a group of people, and in the image that is given of them is that you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense, you say a little prayer for them as you walk away. Hundreds of years later, that mindset of taking advantage of the vulnerable hadn't changed. Even by the days of Jesus, they were still in a circumstance where they would go and devour the most vulnerable they could and take advantage of the weakest among them and take away what little they had left. But they had just a small morsel of religion about them, and so as they walked away after taking everything that this poor widow had for a pretense, they would stop and say, "Oh Lord, please, 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 please help this poor widow because I just took everything she had." You imagine the mindset of a people like that. But they're not all that different. Centuries later, they're not all that different from what's happening here that he's describing for the reasons why his judgment is coming. Arise ye and depart, for this is not your rest, because it is polluted. It shall destroy you, even with its sore destruction. If a man walking in the spirit and falsehood do lie, saying, I will prophesy unto thee of wine and strong drink, he shall even be the prophet of this people. All you got to do to get elevated as a prophet among the people is come and say, hey, it's all great. This is wonderful. Well, they'll just be wine for everybody and strong drink for everybody. And don't concern yourself with these men like Micah and these other guys who continue to try to challenge us and say bad things are coming and rough times are ahead. They only would elevate the prophets who told them this kind of message. He'll be the prophet to the people. But he says, I will surely assemble, O Jacob, all of thee. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together as the sheep of Basra. As the flock in the midst of their fold, they shall make great noise by reason of the multitude of men. The breaker has come up before them, and they have broken up and have passed through the gate, and are gone out by it, and their king shall pass before them, and the Lord on the head of them. Messianic prophecy at the end of that chapter, where he talks to them about this coming king and how the Lord on the head of them, he speaks of this hope that eventually can come to them when he eventually will reassemble with the people. That message has been true, by the way, throughout the prophecies we've been studying. That even in the midst of some pretty severe things that God says, I'm going to bring in judgment, in the midst of it, He will intertwine a message of hope and restoration for them. And ultimately, that always points to the restoration and hope that will be found in Jesus. I'll pause for a minute. Thoughts, questions up to that point? All right, keep going, because we really haven't changed. The narrative doesn't really change for quite a while. And so I said, Hear, I pray you, O heads of Jacob, ye princes of the house of Israel, is it not for you to know judgment, who hate the good and love the evil? You think about this for a second. Shouldn't you understand and have a greater appreciation for the things that God has shown? How is it that you've gotten to a point where you hate good and love evil? That's a dangerous place for anybody, by the way. When other prophecies say, woe unto him who calls good evil and evil good, that sentiment is not just Micah. It's shown in other places as well. And the concept here is to understand and appreciate that when you flip what's valuable and what's not, and when you turn upside down what God has said is good and what God has said is evil, and you flip those, there's trouble's going to happen. And difficulty's going to occur. And maybe we do that more than we admit. Where if there's something out here that we really want to do, or we really like, or we really are interested in, and we begin the rationalization process of why that which is really evil, and it's always for the most part been spoken of as evil, why is it then that, but because I want to receive that, because I want that, then the rationalization process starts going, and I begin to convince myself, well, it's not really that bad. And then maybe not only is it not that bad, but it may actually be something good. And we just begin that process of convincing ourselves. And it happens subtly. Most of the time we don't just wake up and look at something that we've always seen as evil and just arbitrarily in that moment decide, well, no, that's no longer evil, it's now good. Generally it happens over a process of time, as we slowly and subtly begin to rethink our position on what God has clearly stated as good or evil. And that's what they were doing, and that problem continues to even affect us today. Go ahead, Roger. Yeah. 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 This type of evil hasn't left mankind. This is not an anomaly to them. It's not a singular situation. It's something that men have continued to do over a period of time. And anytime man does not want to honor what God wants, he has two choices. He can either try to eradicate God from the conversation. And that's what a lot of men do today. They just try to eradicate God from the conversation. I saw just a small clip today that Stephen Hawking's, did this come out? Did the book just come out? Like his last works from Stephen Hawking, basically entitled, I think, There Is No God, or something like that. Anyway, I'll have to go back and look at it. I just saw a brief just moment, if you're familiar at all. And don't worry about it if you're not familiar at all. But anyway, Um, but that's the other alternative, right? You can try to eradicate God from the conversation so you don't feel any obligation whatsoever. Or you can say, well, I want to stay in connection with God, but I don't like all these rules. And so I'm going to try to rethink or reshape the rules so that I, in my own mind, can stay with God, but just change the rules a little bit. And that's just as much a mistake as just ignoring God completely and trying to take Him out of the equation. Yeah. All right. Notice the description, verse 2. Who pluck off their skin from off them, and their flesh from off their bones, who also eat the flesh of my people, and flay their skin from off them, and they break their bones and chop them in pieces, as for the pot and as the flesh within the cauldron. Now, in the days of Ahaz, that was actually happening. Literally happening in the days of Ahaz. But the overall point is simply this. They were treating men like what? Like animals, right? They were treating men like animals. That's the imagery here. I think that's the slippery slope that no one really wants to have a conversation about. If we put mankind with no one left that has any conscience about these things whatsoever into a pure evolutionary thought, with nobody trying to discuss that, we become nothing more than what? The other animals that are around. We are no more, no greater, no less. We are no different. And we've seen the result of what happens when men start treating each other like animals that can be killed without conscience, when life can be taken away without any concern or care whatsoever. It's what they had become. It's what God's judging them for. And it really, again, isn't a new problem. It's not something, or isn't something that hasn't continued moving forward, where men continue. If there's nothing valuable about human life, if human life isn't considered any greater than any other life that exists within earth, if we're no different than the flower that grows in the field, or the calf that is born on the farm, or the snake that slithers in the grass, if we're no different, then that's going to create a whole nother set of scenarios. Where does conscience come from? Where does morality come from, if that's the case? Yeah, right. Yeah, he saw no distinction and no value in humanity. And that's where they had gotten. And so no wonder why the evils that are happening at their idolatrous worship places all around the region of Judah were occurring when they devalue human life. And that's the way they were behaving. Then shall they cry, verse 4, unto the Lord. But He will not hear them. He will even hide from His face from them at that time, as they have behaved themselves ill in their doings. When they start reaping the consequences of their behaviors, now all of a sudden they want to cry back to God. And I don't want to oversimplify this, but you've probably been in circumstances, maybe if you've got children, where you said, listen, you don't do that. And they're like, no, I want it. And you say, listen, you do that, and it goes awry. Don't what? Don't come crying to me, right? Don't come crying to me when that turns out disastrous. Now, that's oversimplified, but that's kind of what he's saying. He says, listen, You devised it. You chose it. You've been treating each other like animals. You've been oppressive towards the most vulnerable. You'll even take that which belongs to widows and rob them of it. This is the wickedness that you chose, you devised, you've lived for. And then when you start reaping the consequences of that, then you have the audacity to think that now let's run back to God and start crying before Him and have Him correct all the mess that we've made by our own hands and by our own devices. And God says at that point, I'm hiding from you. Thus saith the Lord concerning the prophets that make my people err, that bite with their teeth and cry peace. And he that putteth not into their mouths, they even prepare war against him. God says, there are people out there still professing to be prophets, but they're leading the people astray, telling them that, hey, there's no war, there's no consequence, there's no judgment coming. They're teaching words that God didn't put into their mouths. And therefore night shall be unto you, that you shall not have a vision. And it shall be dark unto you, that you shall not divine. And the sun shall go down over the prophets, and the day shall be dark over them. No more information. No more visions. No more guidance. It's time to reap what they'd sown. And then shall the seers be ashamed, and the diviners confounded. Yea, they shall all cover their lips, for there is no answer of God. And you can imagine it when the difficulties of the circumstances they had created begin to pound and pour in. And that now all of a sudden they're trying to appeal before Jehovah. Well, what do we do? And how do we handle this? And how should we respond? And He said they cover their lips. They don't have anything to say. Because the visions are now dark. There's no enlightenment anymore. There's no guidance coming from God. There's no response or answer coming from Him in light of all these things. They thought it was great when they were telling the people there's no problems coming, there's no difficulties, everything's fine. And then the difficulties begin to mount and they look and find no answer. But truly I am full of power by the Spirit of the Lord, and of judgment and of might, to declare unto Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin. Micah says, the false prophets, the false seers, the false diviners, all those whose eyes are now dark, he said, in the midst of it, I'm full of power by the Spirit. I'm the Spirit of the Lord and the judgment. I'm going to declare the message of the transgressions of Jacob and the sins of Israel, irregardless. Hear this, I pray you, you heads of the house of Jacob and the princes of the house of Israel that abhor judgment and pervert all equity. You leaders who just you pervert judgments. There's nothing equal or equitable about the way you deal with certain circumstances. You abhor anything that's right and good. You build up Zion with blood and Jerusalem with iniquity. You've tried to build this city and this place of God by bloodshed and through sinful practice. You think that's really the growth of a nation that God was looking for, of His people? The heads thereof judge for reward. The priests thereof teach for hire, and the prophets thereof divine for money. Yet will they lean upon the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? None evil can come upon us. They wouldn't do anything unless they what? They got paid to do it. We're not prophesying unless we get paid. Priests won't teach unless we get paid. Judges won't give the equitable or fair judgments unless we get paid. And if they're getting paid, they're not giving fair judgments. Everything was about their greed and their money. Those kinds of situations don't seem to go away sometimes. I ran into a circumstance a few years back where I wasn't there at the moment. This situation was anyway being explained to me, but where a religious man was scheduled to conduct a funeral, and he was 25 minutes late and came in late. Service had already been conducted. They found somebody else to conduct the service, finished the service. The fella come in and made a half-hearted apology and then walked back to the funeral director's office with his hand out. He wanted the honorarium. They said, you didn't hold the service. And he said, I'm here. And friends, that's exactly the way these guys have become. It was about the money. It wasn't about prophesying what God wanted them to prophesy about. It wasn't about giving the right judgments and being fair and equitable. It wasn't about teaching the people what God wanted them to learn. It's sad, but even religious leaders today can become the same as those back in that time. And so God's going to come to Zion. For your sake be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the houses as the high places of the forest. Coming. Judgment's coming. All right, so Lord willing, on Sunday, we'll jump into chapter 4. You didn't think I'd move that fast, but I think we can because of the nature of the book. Now, when I tell you, when we get to chapter 6, we'll slow way down when it comes to that courtroom scene. But we'll move it pretty quickly for the time being. So read the rest of it before Sunday. It's only four more chapters. So read the rest of it.